It was a quiet Sunday morning outside St. James Church. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the street. The church was a peaceful place, and for many of the people in the neighborhood, it was a sanctuary. Every Sunday, people gathered to celebrate their faith, seek comfort, and spend time with loved ones. The air was cool, and the sound of distant chatter filled the streets as families and individuals walked toward the church doors. Among the people heading toward the entrance that morning was 32-year-old Sarah Martinez, a regular attendee. She had been coming to the church for as long as she could remember. A strong sense of community had always been important to her, and she found peace in the church's calm atmosphere. Sarah, however, wasn't like everyone else who walked into the building that morning. Sarah was deaf. She had been born without the ability to hear, but it never held her back. She had learned to read lips, use sign language, and communicate with everyone she met. Her disability never stopped her from leading a fulfilling life. She had a steady job, close friends, and a family who loved her. As Sarah approached the church, she saw a police car parked across the street. At first, she thought nothing of it. The officer sitting inside the car seemed calm, just passing the time. But as she made her way past the vehicle, something caught her attention, a voice calling out behind her. It wasn't unusual for people to greet each other outside the church, but this voice sounded different. It wasn't friendly, nor was it the typical greeting she was used to. She turned around, meeting the eyes of Officer James, who was stepping out of his patrol car. His tone was firm. "Hey, you," he called out. Sarah didn't immediately respond. She hadn't heard him, and she certainly didn't recognize him. She continued walking towards the entrance, unaware of the situation developing behind her. The officer, noticing that she didn't respond, started walking toward her. "I said, stop right there." His voice was more insistent now. Sarah paused, sensing something was wrong. She turned around slowly, facing him. She didn't know why he was speaking to her, but she couldn't hear the words. Instead, she looked at his lips, trying to understand what he was saying. The days following the incident were filled with questions, confusion, and a sense of unease. Sarah had been in the hospital for a few days, recovering from the shock of the taser. Though her physical injuries were minor, the emotional toll had been immense. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything had spiraled out of control so quickly, and now, there were so many questions that needed answers. How could the officer not have known she was deaf? Why hadn't he taken the time to understand her before using force? And why had the FBI been called in? Weeks passed, and the investigation into the incident involving Sarah continued to unfold. The shock of what had happened to her was still fresh, but she was no longer sitting idle in the hospital room. Sarah had spent days recovering physically, but the emotional impact of that fateful day was something she would carry for a long time. The pain she felt wasn't just from the taser or the confusion that came with it, it was from the feeling that her voice had been silenced when she needed it most. The local media had kept the story in the spotlight, but now, as the investigation progressed, there was a shift in the public's attention. People weren't just angry anymore, they were beginning to demand answers. The pressure on the police department was building, and with every passing day, more and more people were showing up at rallies, calling for justice for Sarah. At first, Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to be the face of such a movement. She had never wanted fame or recognition. She had simply wanted to go about her life, free of misunderstandings. But now, she realized that her story had become much bigger than herself. It wasn't just about what happened to her on that Sunday morning outside the church, it was about raising awareness of the challenges faced by people with disabilities, especially when it came to interactions with law enforcement. Sarah's attorney, Jessica, had been working tirelessly on the case. She had gathered witness statements, reviewed the body camera footage, and carefully examined the circumstances that had led to the officer using force. The footage showed the officer's actions, from the moment he first approached Sarah to the moment he deployed the taser. There was no attempt to communicate with her, no understanding of her deafness, no patience or consideration. The officer's behavior was reckless, and the more Jessica reviewed the evidence, the clearer it became that Sarah had been treated unfairly. One afternoon, Jessica came to visit Sarah at her home. She had a folder of documents in her hands and a determined look on her face. "I think it's time we take the next step," Jessica said as she sat down beside Sarah. "We've got a solid case." The officer failed to follow proper protocol. He didn't give you the chance to explain yourself, and he didn't attempt to communicate with you. We have a real shot at holding him accountable. Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of relief. She had been nervous about the legal process, unsure of what to expect, but hearing Jessica's confidence gave her a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure no one else would go through what she had experienced. She wanted to ensure that people with disabilities were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Over the next few days, the pressure on the police department and the officer involved grew. The FBI had already conducted interviews with the officer, as well as the other officers present at the scene. The officer had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Though the local police department had initially supported the officer, public opinion was shifting, and they were now facing mounting criticism for the way the situation had been handled. In the community, there were rallies and marches in support of Sarah. People were speaking out about the need for better training for law enforcement, particularly in dealing with individuals with disabilities. Some people held signs that read, "Justice for Sarah," while others spoke about the importance of awareness and understanding. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to speak in front of the crowd, but the support from those around her made her feel less alone. She knew that this movement was bigger than her. It was about making sure the mistakes of that one officer didn't happen again. The news coverage also continued. Reporters gathered outside the police department, eager for updates on the investigation. There were questions about the officer's future and whether he would face criminal charges. Sarah's story had touched a nerve, and it was clear that the conversation about how people with disabilities were treated by law enforcement was one that needed to be had. Despite all the attention, Sarah remained focused on the bigger picture. She didn't want the focus to be solely on the officer who had tossed her. Yes, he needed to be held accountable for his actions, but there were larger issues at play. How many other people had been misunderstood by law enforcement simply because of a disability? How many had been treated unfairly, just as she had been? Sarah wanted to make sure that the conversation didn't end with her case. She wanted it to continue, to bring about real change. Sarah had always been a quiet person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But this experience had shown her how powerful it could be when people came together to fight for what was right. As she watched the rallies and read the stories of people who had faced similar struggles, she felt a sense of pride. She had never asked for any of this, but now that it was happening, she was determined to see it through. The police department issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising to review their policies regarding interactions with people with disabilities. There was talk of introducing new training for officers, ensuring they were better equipped to handle situations like Sarah's. But Sarah knew that words weren't enough. She had heard promises before. What mattered was action, and that was something that would take time. She wasn't sure how long it would take, but she knew that the fight had only just begun. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's case continued to make its way through the legal system. The officer who had tossed her was facing serious scrutiny, and the community was waiting to see what action would be taken. Would he be charged with misconduct? Would he face consequences for his actions? The uncertainty hung in the air, but one thing was clear: Sarah had sparked a movement, and she had become a symbol of resilience and strength. She didn't know how it would all end, but she knew that she had made a difference. The support she had received from her family, her community, and even strangers had given her the courage to keep going. She had never expected to be the face of a cause, but now, she couldn't back down. Her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for everyone who had ever been misunderstood or mistreated because of a disability. As she sat in her living room one evening, surrounded by her family, Sarah thought about everything that had happened. It felt surreal, the way her life had changed so quickly, but she knew that this experience had made her stronger. She had learned that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to stand up and be heard. And no matter what happened next, she would always be proud of the courage she had shown. The case wasn't over yet, but Sarah knew that the road ahead would be different. It would be a road where people like her wouldn't have to fight alone, where their voices would be heard, and where their lives would matter. And as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would keep fighting for that change. The media coverage continued to grow. Every news outlet in town seemed to be covering the story. The headlines read, "Deaf woman tossed by officer outside church," and "FBI investigates police overuse of force on deaf woman." The story was everywhere, and with every passing hour, it seemed like more people were getting involved. Sarah's story had become a symbol for something bigger, something that needed to be addressed. The FBI agents were still investigating, interviewing the officers involved and gathering witness statements. They had already spoken to several people who had been present at the scene, and they were piecing together the events of that morning. It was clear that the officer had acted too quickly, without fully understanding the situation. But there was more to the story than just one officer's mistake. The investigation would take time, and it wasn't going to be easy. The more they dug into the incident, the more questions they had about the training officers received when it came to dealing with people with disabilities. As the investigation continued, the local police department issued a statement saying that they were cooperating fully with the FBI and would make sure that the incident was thoroughly examined. But Sarah couldn't help but feel like the whole situation was out of her control. She was just a woman walking to church, and now she was at the center of a national conversation about police use of force and the treatment of people with disabilities. Despite everything, Sarah's family stood by her. Her parents had flown in from out of town to be with her, and Maria, her sister, had been her constant support. Maria had been with Sarah every step of the way, offering comfort and encouragement as the days dragged on. She had witnessed the whole incident unfold and knew just how much it had affected her sister. Sarah had always been strong, but this was something else entirely. This was a public fight for justice, and it was taking a toll on her. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her hospital room, watching the news coverage. The reporters were outside, talking to people from the community who were angry about what had happened. "She didn't deserve this," one person said on camera. "The officer should have known better." Others spoke about the need for better training for police officers to handle situations involving people with disabilities. The outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming, but it also made Sarah feel uneasy. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, and now, she couldn't escape it. Maria sat with her, gently rubbing her back as they watched the news together. "You don't have to do this," Maria said softly. "You don't have to fight this fight if you don't want to." But Sarah shook her head. She couldn't stay silent. She knew that what had happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident. There were so many people like her, people who had been misunderstood or treated unfairly because of their disabilities. She couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. "I have to speak up," Sarah signed, her hands moving with determination. "If I don't, then nothing will change." Maria nodded, understanding the strength that Sarah had always carried with her. "I'm with you, every step of the way," she said, squeezing Sarah's hand. The next day, Sarah's attorney, a woman named Jessica, came to visit her. Jessica was a calm and collected woman, and she had been working with Sarah since the beginning of the case. She had been gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and preparing for the legal battles that were sure to come. She had already started building a case against the officer, but there was still so much work to be done. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Jessica said as she sat down next to Sarah. "But I believe we can make a real difference with this case." We've already gathered statements from witnesses who say that the officer never made an effort to communicate with you before using the taser. And the fact that you were deaf, well, that makes this case even more important. We need to make sure that the police are properly trained to handle situations like this." Sarah nodded, grateful for the support. She knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Jessica by her side, she felt a little bit stronger. She wanted to make sure that this wasn't just about her own experience. She wanted to help create change, not just for herself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. She wanted to make sure that people with disabilities weren't overlooked or misunderstood by those who were supposed to protect them. Meanwhile, the local community continued to rally behind Sarah. People were organizing protests, demanding that the officer be held accountable for his actions. Social media was flooded with messages of support, with hashtags like #Justice for Sarah and #Deaf Lives Matter trending across platforms. Sarah's story had sparked a movement, and it was clear that people were paying attention. At the same time, the FBI was continuing its investigation. They had already interviewed the officer who had tossed Sarah, as well as the other officers who had been on the scene. They were reviewing the body camera footage, which showed the officer's actions in real time. The footage revealed that the officer had not attempted to communicate with Sarah in any way before using force. He had simply assumed she was ignoring him, which had led to the escalation. The FBI agents were now trying to determine whether the officer's actions were justified or if they had violated department protocol. While all of this was going on, Sarah's family continued to support her. They were proud of her for standing up, but they also wanted to make sure she was taking care of herself. Her parents had stayed in town to help, making sure she wasn't overwhelmed by the media attention. Maria had taken time off work to stay with Sarah, ensuring that she wasn't alone during the difficult days. Despite everything, Sarah knew that the hardest part was still to come. The court case was looming, and the spotlight on her would only grow brighter. But she was determined. She was determined to make sure that her voice was heard, that the officer would be held accountable for his actions, and that changes would be made to prevent this from happening again. Sarah smiled and shook her head gently, raising her hand in a gesture that said, "Sorry, I'm deaf." She motioned to her ears, trying to communicate that she hadn't heard him and wasn't ignoring him on purpose. The officer's face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he didn't understand. His eyes scanned her face as if searching for a response. Sarah continued to smile, patiently waiting for him to grasp her situation. But instead of offering understanding, the officer's confusion seemed to grow. As Sarah lay on T, the next few moments were a blur for Sarah. She was still struggling to gather her thoughts, her body feeling shaky from the taser's after effects. The paramedics were checking her vitals, asking her questions, but her mind felt distant. All she could hear was the growing noise from the crowd around her. Voices were rising in confusion and anger. Some people were shouting questions, while others were speaking in hushed tones, wondering what would happen next. The FBI agents moved with a sense of urgency. Their black SUVs had parked close by, and their presence made it clear that something serious was unfolding. They spoke in low voices among themselves, occasionally exchanging words with the local officers. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Sarah didn't know what to think. She had gone from enjoying a peaceful Sunday to being the center of a scene that was rapidly spiraling out of control. As Sarah was escorted to the ambulance, she looked back at the church. It was a quiet building, a place of peace and reflection, but today it had become the backdrop of something much larger. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She still couldn't fully understand why the officer had tossed her. She had only been walking toward the church, preparing for a calm day. Now, the FBI was here, and she was being whisked away in an ambulance. The paramedics kept checking on her, asking if she could move her arms and legs, trying to make sure there were no lasting effects from the taser. But Sarah was more focused on the confusion surrounding her. Her mind was foggy, and her emotions were all over the place. She had felt helpless when the officer had raised his taser, and now, as she sat in the back of the ambulance, the helplessness hadn't gone away. As the paramedics continued their work, Sarah overheard some of the crowd's conversations. They were speculating, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. She didn't even hear him, one man said. How could he do that? Another person added, she's a regular here. I've seen her come to church for years. This is crazy. The officer who had tossed her remained standing off to the side, watching the ambulance as it drove off. His face was still tense, and he hadn't made any attempt to explain himself. He seemed to be standing there, waiting for the situation to resolve itself. But no one seemed to know what to do. The FBI agents, too, were focused on the officers who had been involved, asking them questions and taking notes. They moved quickly, quietly, but their presence was undeniable. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the media had arrived. Reporters were gathered outside, waiting to catch a glimpse of what was going on. The story had already begun to spread across social media, and soon enough, the incident was making headlines. The once quiet neighborhood was now under a spotlight. Everyone wanted to know why the officer had acted the way he had. Why hadn't he realized that Sarah was deaf? Why hadn't he taken a moment to understand the situation before using force? Inside the hospital, Sarah was placed in a quiet room. The paramedics continued to check on her, but she felt out of place. She had never imagined something like this happening to her, and she wasn't sure what to expect next. She felt a wave of frustration wash over her. It wasn't just the shock from the taser, but the feeling that no one had understood her. No one had taken the time to realize that she wasn't being rude or uncooperative. She was simply unable to hear the officer. A nurse came in and asked her if she needed anything, but Sarah didn't know how to respond. Her hands fumbled, unsure whether to explain herself or simply accept the silence. It was hard for her to explain what had happened because even now, it felt surreal. But she didn't want to be left alone. She wanted someone to understand. Outside her room, voices grew louder as more people from the media and the community gathered. News outlets were broadcasting live, and the story had already sparked outrage. People who had known Sarah were coming forward, sharing their experiences with her. She's one of the kindest people I know, a woman said. She's always helping out. This shouldn't have happened to her. The FBI agents were still busy at the scene, talking with local officers and gathering information. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy case to resolve. The more the agents spoke with the officers, the more they realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The use of the taser hadn't been appropriate, especially in a situation where there had been no immediate threat. And the fact that Sarah was deaf had only made things worse. The officer had failed to recognize the signs that Sarah couldn't hear him, and that failure had led to the shocking escalation. As Sarah lay in the hospital bed, she could hear bits and pieces of the conversations happening outside her room. The air was filled with frustration and disbelief, not just from her family and friends but from the community at large. The whole situation seemed wrong. How could someone have acted so rashly without understanding the full picture? How could someone have made such a mistake? The door to Sarah's room opened, and a familiar face appeared, her sister, Maria. Maria rushed to her side, her face full of concern. "Are you okay?" Maria asked softly, taking Sarah's hand in hers. Sarah nodded weakly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel like a victim. But the emotions had built up, and it was hard to hold them back. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," Maria whispered. "This isn't your fault." Sarah wanted to speak, but the words felt trapped inside her. She couldn't find the right way to explain everything that had happened. She couldn't express how unfair it had all felt. She had been walking to church, minding her own business, and suddenly, everything had changed. Maria stayed with her for a while, offering comfort and reassurance. She listened as Sarah tried to explain in her own way what had happened, using her hands and gestures to tell the story. Maria's eyes filled with sympathy as she watched her sister's struggle. She knew that Sarah had faced many challenges in her life due to her deafness, but this was different. This was something no one should have to go through. Outside the hospital, the media coverage intensified. People were demanding answers. Why had the officer used such force? Why hadn't he realized that Sarah was deaf? The questions were endless, and they all pointed to one thing: the officer's actions had been an overreaction. As the day went on, more and more people spoke out, calling for justice for Sarah. The FBI continued its investigation, but it was clear that the situation was far from over. This wasn't just about a single officer's mistake. It was about larger issues about understanding, communication, and the need for better training for law enforcement. Sarah's story had captured the attention of many, and as the news spread, it became clear that the community wasn't going to let this go quietly. They would stand by Sarah and make sure that her voice was heard. He ground, still struggling to shake off the painful effects of the taser. The world around her seemed to blur. The electricity had coursed through her body so quickly that her muscles locked up. Her chest felt tight, and every breath she tried to take came out shallow and uneven. The air was thick with confusion and fear, not just for her but for the people who had witnessed the incident. The officer stood still, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and uncertainty. His grip on the taser loosened slightly, but he didn't seem to know what to do next. He had expected the situation to resolve easily, but now, faced with an unarmed woman lying on the ground, his authority felt fragile. The bystanders, some of whom had been watching the scene unfold, now moved closer, murmuring and questioning what had just happened. A few of them had already pulled out their phones to record the scene, while others rushed to Sarah's side to make sure she was okay. "Is she all right?" one person asked, kneeling beside her. They gently tried to help Sarah sit up, but she struggled to find her balance, still dizzy from the shock. Her eyes searched the faces around her, hoping someone would understand her situation. She had lived her whole life not hearing words but communicating with gestures and expressions. She had learned to rely on lip reading, but this situation was different. This wasn't a misunderstanding about what she had said or done. It was a misunderstanding about who she was. One of the people in the crowd, a woman named Rachel, had seen the whole thing from across the street. She was a regular churchgoer, just like Sarah, and she had recognized the officer's mistake almost immediately. Rachel had seen the officer shouting at Sarah, but when he raised his hand to demand her attention, she knew something was wrong. She had seen Sarah's gentle hand gesture, a clear sign that she couldn't hear the officer's commands. But the officer hadn't seen it. He had assumed Sarah was being defiant or ignoring him, and that assumption had led to the shocking escalation. Rachel's heart raced as she knelt down beside Sarah, speaking softly to her. "Are you okay? We're going to get you some help." She placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, trying to offer comfort, but the fear and shock in Sarah's eyes were unmistakable. Sarah nodded weakly, but it was clear she needed help. The crowd had started to grow, and some people were beginning to voice their anger. They were angry not just for Sarah but at the way the officer had acted. One man in the crowd shouted, "Why did he do that? She didn't do anything wrong." His voice was full of frustration, and others around him began to echo his thoughts. "She didn't even hear him. She's deaf. He didn't even ask if she needed help." More people joined in, calling out in anger and confusion. The officer's face reddened, but he didn't move. He didn't know what to say to defend himself. He was in a situation he had never faced before, and there was no clear answer. Within minutes, a police backup unit arrived at the scene. Several more officers stepped out of their vehicles, and the tension in the air grew thick. It seemed like the situation was spiraling out of control, but there was something else in the air now, a different kind of urgency. Something larger than just an officer and a woman was brewing. A woman from the crowd had called for an ambulance, and within moments, paramedics arrived with their lights flashing. The paramedics immediately moved to Sarah's side, helping her sit up carefully. She was still feeling weak, and her heart was pounding in her chest. They checked her vitals and spoke to her in a calm, soothing voice. "We're going to take care of you. You're going to be fine," one of them said, but Sarah could hear the faint tremor in their voice. Despite their reassurances, Sarah could see the way the police were looking at her, as if they had underestimated her. They didn't know her story. They didn't know what it was like to be deaf in a world that relied on sound. They didn't understand how she had lived through so many misunderstandings, some small, some larger, but none like this. The officer who had tossed her still stood there, watching from a distance. He was now joined by his fellow officers, who were murmuring to each other, exchanging glances. The backup officers seemed confused too, unsure of what had really happened. Some of them looked at Sarah with pity, while others remained distant, unsure how to respond to the growing public outrage. It was clear that the situation was far from over. As the paramedics helped Sarah to her feet, Rachel whispered, "Don't worry. We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. We'll make sure they know what happened." But Sarah wasn't sure what she was feeling at that moment. She wasn't sure whether she was scared, angry, or just overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life. One moment she had been walking toward the church, looking forward to a quiet Sunday morning, and now, she was at the center of an unfolding situation she couldn't control. Just as the paramedics were preparing to escort Sarah to the ambulance, a new sound filled the air, the wail of sirens in the distance. More sirens. It was a sound that normally signaled the arrival of more officers or emergency vehicles, but this time, it was different. The sound seemed to get closer and closer, and soon, several black SUVs pulled up to the scene. The vehicles were unmarked, and the presence of these cars added a level of seriousness that no one had anticipated. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and many people turned to watch as the FBI agents stepped out of their vehicles. "FBI," someone in the crowd whispered, and the word spread like wildfire. "Why is the FBI here?" It was a question no one could answer, not yet anyway. The officers and agents began to form a perimeter around the area, making it clear that this wasn't just a local police matter anymore. The FBI agents moved quickly, talking to local officers and asking questions, all while keeping an eye on Sarah and the crowd. No one knew exactly what was going on, but the heavy presence of the FBI suggested that this incident was going to go far beyond the local level. The FBI agents didn't interact with Sarah directly. They seemed focused on the police officers who had been present during the incident. Their eyes were trained on the officers, as if they were trying to understand what had gone wrong and whether the use of force was warranted. Sarah felt a wave of emotions flood over her: confusion, frustration, and even fear. She hadn't expected any of this. She hadn't expected to become the center of such an intense investigation. But as she was helped into the ambulance, she realized that the story wasn't over yet. It had just begun. The situation was bigger than she could have ever imagined. The crowd continued to grow, and the cameras began to flash as news crews arrived on the scene. Word of the incident had already spread, and reporters were beginning to ask questions. The situation had become a full-blown spectacle, and all Sarah could do was sit there, in the back of the ambulance, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had no idea that the pain she felt from the taser would be nothing compared to what lay ahead. "Ma'am, I need you to step over here," Officer James said, pointing to the side of the road. Sarah, not understanding his demand and not realizing the seriousness of the situation, took a step forward toward the church entrance. She thought maybe he was just directing her to walk a little further to avoid blocking the path. She didn't realize the officer had begun to feel frustrated. Before Sarah could move any further, the officer raised his voice again, this time much louder. "I said stop. Do you understand me?" His words were sharp, and the anger in his voice was clear. Sarah was caught off guard. She tried to read his lips once again, her hands still motioning to show her inability to hear. But the officer wasn't patient anymore. He stepped closer to her, his face red with frustration. He had no idea how to handle the situation. Sarah, still not understanding the tension building, continued to move toward the entrance of the church. Without warning, the officer reached for his taser. The sudden motion of his hand grabbed Sarah's attention. Her eyes widened, but before she could even process what was happening, the officer deployed the taser. The sharp crack of the electricity filled the air, followed by the jolt of pain that shot through Sarah's body. The shock was instantaneous, and it made her collapse to the ground. The crowd nearby gasped in shock. People froze, watching as Sarah lay on the ground, twitching from the electrical shock. Her body was tense, and her mind scrambled to understand what had just happened. She hadn't been given a chance to explain herself. She hadn't been given any clear instructions. The officer hadn't recognized the simple, life-changing fact that she was deaf. The sounds of murmurs filled the air as bystanders rushed forward. Some tried to help her, while others simply stood back, confused by what they had just witnessed. Sarah's body twitched with the last remnants of the electric shock, and she struggled to breathe for a moment as the effects of the taser wore off. People around her began to yell for help, some shouting for an ambulance, while others seemed to be questioning the officer's actions. The officer stood there, still gripping his taser, as he looked at Sarah, who was now on the ground, struggling to regain her composure. His face shifted from frustration to uncertainty. He had done something, but he didn't quite know why it had escalated so quickly. The crowd's gaze shifted from Sarah to the officer. There was a strange mix of fear and disbelief in the air. Sarah, still on the ground, stared up at the officer with wide, confused eyes. She was in shock, not just from the electric jolt but from the realization that the person who was supposed to protect and serve had misunderstood her completely. "Are you okay?" a voice from the crowd called out, but Sarah could only manage a slight nod. She was still trying to catch her breath, and her head was spinning. But there was no time to think. The flashing lights of more police cars appeared in the distance. Something was happening, something big. And before she could comprehend what was coming, the sound of sirens filled the air.